attending agreeable conferences of literary types, taking part in the transient arguments that arise in publishing and the academy. But even this rather sheltered existence has been subject to outrageous invasions and insults and challenges. On February the 14th, 1989, my friend Salman Rushdie was hit by a simultaneous death sentence and life sentence for the crime of writing a work of fiction. To be more precise, the theocratic head of a foreign state, the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, publicly offered money, in his own name, to suborn the murder of a novelist who was a citizen of another country. Those who were encouraged to carry out this bribed assassination scheme, which extended to all those involved in the publication of the Satanic Verses, were offered not just the cold cash, but also a free ticket to paradise. It's impossible to imagine a greater affront to every value of free expression. The Ayatollah had not read, and probably could not read, and in any case forbade everyone else to read, the novel. But he succeeded in igniting ugly demonstrations among Muslims in Britain as well as across the world, where crowds burned the book and screamed for the author to be fed to the flames as well. This episode, partly horrifying and partly grotesque, of course had its origins in the material or real world. The Ayatollah, having flung away hundreds of thousands of young Iranian lives in an attempt to prolong the war which Saddam Hussein had started, and thereby to turn it into a victory for his own reactionary theology, had recently been forced to acknowledge reality and to agree to the United Nations ceasefire resolution that he had sworn he would drink poison before signing. He was in need, in other words, of an issue. A group of reactionary Muslims in South Africa, who sat in the puppet parliament of the apartheid regime, had announced that if Mr. Rushdie attended a book fair in their country, he would be killed. A fundamentalist group in Pakistan had shed blood on the streets. Khomeini had to prove that he could not be outdone by anybody. As it happens, there are some statements allegedly made by the Prophet Muhammad which are difficult to reconcile with Muslim teaching. Quranic scholars had attempted to square this circle by suggesting that in these instances the Prophet was accidentally taking dictation from Satan instead of from God. This ruse, which would not have disgraced the most sinuous school of medieval Christian apologetics, provided an excellent opportunity for a novelist to explore the relationship between Holy Writ and literature. But the literal mind does not understand the ironic mind, and sees it always as a source of danger. Moreover, Rushdie had been brought up as a Muslim, and had an understanding of the Quran, which meant in effect that he was an apostate. And apostasy, according to the Quran, is punishable by death. There is no right to change religion, and all religious states have always insisted on harsh penalties for those who try it. A number of serious attempts were made to kill Rushdie by religious death squads supported from Iranian embassies. His Italian and Japanese translators were criminally assaulted, apparently in one case in the absurd belief that the translator might know his whereabouts, and one of them was savagely mutilated as he lay dying. His Norwegian publisher was shot in the back several times with a high-velocity rifle, and left for dead in the snow, but astonishingly survived. One might have thought that such arrogant state-sponsored homicide, directed at a lonely and peaceful individual who pursued a life devoted to language, would have called forth a general condemnation, but such was not the case. In considered statements, the Vatican, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel all took a stand in sympathy with the Ayatollah. So did the Cardinal Archbishop of New York and many other lesser religious figures. While they usually managed a few words in which to deplore the resort to violence, all these men stated that the main problem, raised by the publication of the Satanic Verses, was not murder by mercenaries, but blasphemy. Some public figures not in holy orders, such as the Marxist writer John Berger, the Tory historian Hugh Trevor Roper, and the doyen of espionage authors John le Carré, also pronounced that Rushdie was the author of his own troubles, and had brought them on himself by offending the great monotheistic religion. There seemed nothing fantastic to these people in the British police having to defend an Indian-born ex-Muslim citizen from a concerted campaign to take his life in the name of God. Sheltered as my own life normally is, I had a taste of this surreal situation when Mr. Rushdie came to Washington over the Thanksgiving weekend of 1993 in order to keep an appointment with President Clinton, and stayed for a night or two in my apartment. An enormous and forbidding security operation was necessary to bring this about, and when the visit was over, I was asked to pay a visit to the Department of State. There I was informed by a senior official that believable chatter had been intercepted, expressing the intention of revenge on me and on my family. I was advised to change my address and my telephone number, which seemed an unlikely way of avoiding reprisal. However, it did put me on notice of what I already knew. It is not possible for me to say, well, you pursue your Shiite dream of a hidden imam, and I pursue my study of Thomas Paine and George Orwell, and the world is big enough for both of us. The true believer cannot rest until the whole world bows the knee. Is it not obvious to all, say the pious, that religious authority is paramount, and that those who decline to recognize it have forfeited their right to exist? It was, as it happens, the murderers of the Shia who forced this point upon the world's attention a few years later. So ghastly had been the regime of the Taliban in Afghanistan, which slaughtered the Shiite Hazara population, that Iran itself had considered invading the country in 1999. And so great was the Taliban's addiction to profanity that it had methodically shelled and destroyed one of the world's greatest cultural artifacts, the twin Buddha statues at Bamiyan, which in their magnificence showed the fusion of Hellenic and other styles in the Afghan past. But, pre-Islamic as they undoubtedly were, the statues were a standing insult to the Taliban and their al-Qaeda guests. And the reduction of Bamiyan to shards and rubble foreshadowed the incineration of two other twin structures, as well as almost 3,000 human beings, in downtown Manhattan in the fall of 2001. Everybody has their own 9/11 story. I shall skip over mine, except to say that someone I slightly knew was flown into the wall of the Pentagon, having managed to call her husband and give a description of her murderers and their tactics, and having learned from him that it was not a hijack and that she was going to die. From the roof of my building in Washington I could see the smoke rising from the other side of the river, and I have never since passed the Capitol or the White House without thinking of what might have happened, were it not for the courage and resourcefulness of the passengers on the fourth plane, who managed to bring it down in a Pennsylvanian field, only 20 minutes flying time from its destination. Well, I was able to write, in a further reply to Dennis Prager, now you have your answer. The 19 suicide murderers of New York and Washington and Pennsylvania were beyond any doubt the most sincere believers on those planes. Perhaps we can hear a little less about how people of faith possess moral advantages that others can only envy, and what is to be learned from the jubilation and the ecstatic propaganda with which this great feat of fidelity has been greeted in the Islamic world. At the time, the United States had an Attorney General named John Ashcroft, who had stated that America had no king but Jesus, a claim that was exactly 2 words too long. It had a president who wanted to hand over the care of the poor to faith-based institutions. Might this not be a moment where the light of reason and the defence of a society that separated church and state and valued free expression and free inquiry be granted a point or two? The disappointment was, and to me remains, acute. Within hours, the Reverends Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell had announced that the immolation of their fellow creatures was a divine judgment on a secular society that tolerated homosexuality and abortion. At the solemn memorial service for the victims, held in the beautiful National Cathedral in Washington, an address was permitted from Billy Graham, a man whose record of opportunism and anti-Semitism is in itself a minor national disgrace. His absurd sermon made the claim that all the dead were now in paradise, and would not return to us even if they could. I say absurd because it's impossible, even in the most lenient terms, to believe that a good number of sinful citizens had not been murdered by al-Qaeda that day. And there is no reason to believe that Billy Graham knew the current whereabouts of their souls, let alone of their posthumous desires. But there was also something sinister in hearing detailed claims to knowledge of paradise, of the sort that bin Laden himself was making on behalf of the assassins.